Hello.
All right.
Mic check.
So welcome everybody today to SYN217 multi-site recommended practices. So before we start, I offered the guys to do an introduction, but I also told them that I would totally make things up about them. So they want to introduce themselves. Dave, do you want to?
Yep. So my name is Dave Brett. I am based in Liphook in the south of England. My Twitter handle is @dbretty, it's up there, and I'm a Citrix CTP.
My name is Jarian Gibson. I'm a Senior Solutions Architect for Nutanix in the Performance Solutions and Engineering Group, focused on EUC. I'm also a Citrix CTP, and you can find me @Jarian Gibson on Twitter.
My name is Kees Boggerman. I work in the Performance Solution Engineering team, where I'm a Technical Director at Nutanix, and I'm also a Citrix CTP.
I'm also his minion, so.
Hey everybody, Shane Kleinert, Choice Solutions, Senior Solutions Architect based out of the Southeast region. And I do have a face. If you look at the app, I didn't submit my face or my profile, so I am real. So looking forward to kicking things off today.
All right, so let's move on to the agenda. It's a 90-minute session. We've got a lot of slides, a lot of ground to cover, a lot of demos as well. So we're not going through every single item that we're going to hit because we've got over 140 slides, 10 demos, 22 key subjects we want to touch upon. So be prepared. We're going to do this in a rapid pace because we do have a lot of content to share with you. But these are the key items that we're going to discuss, like why are we doing this multi-site presentation? What are your typical decisions that you would see in a multi-site consideration level of detail? So we'll dive into to detail a little bit more on some of these components and what's going on in the real world. Obviously, we've got some housekeeping rules. It's a 90-minute session, so if you have to go to the restrooms, please do so. We don't want to keep you here and.
There's actually a restroom in the
one just there.
Yeah, it worked out good. We planned that.
So feel free to do so. Please come back because we do appreciate you coming
Lock
over
the doors.
to the session. Also, and this is important to us, this is the hashtag for our session, SYN217. Please leave feedback, right? These guys have done this session last year, and we're back based on your feedback. Apparently, Citrix saw the feedback, and they appreciated the time that these guys have invested in this session. And we want to improve our session as well. So, although we appreciate your being here, if you have feedback, leave it with this hashtag, and we'll improve our session even more.
Since we have a lot of content, we'll try to have questions at the end, but if we don't get to the questions at the end, feel free to grab us after at the conference or even ping us on Twitter as well. We'll be happy to answer any questions if we can't get to them today.
Yeah, just take a second. One of the things that we did, Dave had spent a lot of time and team here to build out a kind of a real-world scenario lab that we did a lot of the testing and demo videos in. So it was basically a multi-site available lab. So we basically built it. We had Dave's basement under his bed in Liphook, UK. We had a VPN, site-to-site VPN out to Azure UK South. We had a secondary region in the US, and then we had we had Citrix Cloud regions, and we also had an on-prem Citrix deployment, and everything was fully highly available through the whole stack, which we'll talk through today. So we're looking forward to it.
So Dave, do you want to start off with talking through what a multi-site is?
100%. So if you think about multi-site, you need to, the dictionary definition of it is having or involving more than one site. If you think of that in end-user computing, it's splitting or spreading your services across multiple access points. And that doesn't necessarily mean it needs to be in a different data center or even a different country. You can have scenarios like Ryan has where you have services split across multiple entry points within the same data center. Some of the common multi-site scenarios we come across are active-active, active-passive, and then one active-active pinned. And that's where you use both data centers, but you designate resources to run out of one or the other, depending on that resource. Other considerations, putting users near their geographical location. That's really important because you don't want to be logging on in Sydney and your data's in the Netherlands, not Holland, because the performance will be awful. And once the performance goes down, there's a point up there about user experience, the minute you start impacting on user experience, it will fail from there on in. And allowing failover. We talked about this earlier, didn't we? It's whether it's required and then allowing that to happen.
These are business considerations.
Yeah,
These are
yeah.
not technical considerations to start off with. So from our perspective, we start off with business considerations
Yes.
and work our way through the stack.
So if we look at active-active, you have users all over the world. You've got devices all over the world. We also were discussing this earlier. This is becoming more and more apparent now because of the sheer number of devices that you can access your deployments from. So you need to be able to identify them and apply the right policy. You've got access points all over the world and data. And you need to link all of that together. But then what you also need to do, if you lose data or an access point, you need to seamlessly route that user via another region or another part of your multi-site deployment. So that's complex, really complex-ish. So we had a conversation about this, and we were all going, multi-site, it's really difficult, And then Case actually had a really valid point about
I had a moment of clarity there. So who thinks that a car engine is complex to operate? Like if you open up the hood and you look at the car engine, who thinks it's complex? I do, right? I've got no technical background other than this stuff. So if I look at a car engine, I think it's complex. But if you look at car shops, they'll have one or two mechanics, they'll have the right tools, and they can fix your engine. So why are we considering this as complex? Because it might be the first time we look at it. It might be multiple layers that we never have to touch. But again, if a single engineer can fix my car engine, then why couldn't we do this in an active-active?
It's about knowing what you want, documenting and planning it out, and testing. Really, really testing it. That's where you will fall over if you don't do that properly. So if this goes wrong, blame him.
Yeah, so we had fun with this. We just recently presented at the Great Plains XL event. We did some live polling, and it got some good feedback, so we said, let's try it out. So we got this QR code here, which basically is going to be a live poll. We're going to ask some questions throughout the presentation. So go ahead, and the first question is, are you currently implementing multi-site today? So go ahead and scan it, vote, and please vote, otherwise I'm going to look like an asshole because we had a bet. I have to do 500 push-ups in front of everybody right here, and I'll get to like 10.
The last minute.
So give you a few minutes to vote.
Yes.
Just kidding. We got to move on. So did everyone vote? Raise your hand. Yes. Good. All right. 2 people raise their hand. All right. Let's move on. All right. So let's take a look at the results.
Drum rolls.
And here we are. Drum roll. Holy wow, look at this. The results are still coming in, ladies and gentlemen. Here we go. We got 72.4% on yes, and we got 27.1% on no. Do not change your answers. Wow, so how many votes? Holy crap, 60 votes, man. Come on.
Go.
That's awesome. All right, so about 73% of the room is doing some sort of multi-site deployment. That's pretty awesome. Let's rock and roll and move on. So why do failures happen, Jorian?
So let's talk about why failures happen. So you see here in the red, will be unplanned outages, and in the black, we'll have planned outages. So why do failures happen? They will happen, whether they're planned or unplanned. At some point, something is going to fail. We try to best plan for that, and we'll talk about ways you can best plan for that. But there's times where things out of your control just happen, right? Natural disasters and so forth. So you see here, a power outage, unplanned, StoreFront goes down, crashes, unplanned. Oh, it was a bug, so we have a planned outage for a StoreFront fix. But all of a sudden, someone cut your internet links, maybe converged into the same location in your building, and someone cuts the wires. So that's unplanned. And then we have a plan for having different paths coming in different locations of our building to make sure that if one wire gets cut, it's not cutting 2 wires, right? And then we look at, okay, we have all these power outages, they're unplanned, or we have these issues, they're unplanned. Let's go through an environment redesign to see, okay, let's eliminate all single points of failure. Let's make sure that we don't have any of these issues happen to us again. And then some multi-site supporting technology.
All right, so let's talk about the supporting technology for multi-site. You know, Jarian talked about failures happen. We got to plan for those failures. But it's really failures across an entire stack of technology. It's not just Citrix. Citrix is somewhat complicated to get set up, but you can get it set up pretty easily from a multi-site scenario. It's all the other components that really need to be in lockstep. So let's talk about, just throw some hands out. Someone name some technology that should be supported in multi-site. That's a part of it. Someone name something. SQL, yes. A couple more. Go, someone. It's not going as planned.
WEM, that's a good one.
Okay,
Yeah,
one more.
yeah.
Anybody?
AD, anybody?
AD,
DNS,
Office
DHCP?
365, user persona. Let's take a look at some of those technologies. So you might not even thought about this, right? We're just thinking about Citrix and some of the controllers and things like that. But really, if you look at each of these categories, this is just at a high level. You have authentication, which is huge. And authentication is a lot more than it used to be, just Active Directory on-prem. Now we're doing Azure AD, and we're doing federated identity and things like that. All the different provisioning technologies. What are you doing from a network perspective? What deployment type are you going to do? Are you going to do on-prem? Are you going to do actually do hybrid or whatever? And Jarian's going to talk to that in a few minutes. Endpoint management, content collaboration. Application and data and workloads is critical. So these are some of the technologies, and while if you look at this, you're like, holy crap, that's a ton of technology. How can we make that kind of easily to look at and understand from like an architecture reference perspective? We threw this diagram together, and this is kind of how we're going to kind of talk through the presentation going forward. As Case mentioned, we hit on business considerations first, so things like risk, and we're going to talk through risk throughout the presentation through each of these areas, right? RPO, recovery point objective, what point in time do you need to go to? And these are business level questions. This isn't something as an architect that you would make that decision, someone at the business level would. RTO, from how much time can you afford to be down, deployment type. Things like endpoint management, content collaboration, workloads is absolutely critical because it's not just about your application. If you think about your application, you break that down, there's so many other pieces like SQL and file services, et cetera. We'll look at that. GSLB across each of these services. SQL we talked about. Today we're going to be focusing SQL on basic always-on availability groups because a lot of companies are doing mirroring in the past, and now we're doing always-on availability groups. But then recently, basic always-on availability groups came in, which provides a lot of value. App layering, provisioning, networking. Jarian's going to be talking about app layering, provisioning with Case as well, and then Active Directory. And things that are often forgot about are things like file services. I just had a scenario with a customer recently where file server went down, didn't have a secondary namespace for DFSN, as an example, right? Active Directory, printing, and platform is the hypervisor. I'm getting the dude to stop talking thing. So we're going to go ahead and jump right in data center design, where Case is now going to drill down. You didn't expect, jeez, that did not go as planned. I was trying, I thought you were going to just, all right.
So throw a thing to a crippled guy and expect him to catch it.
Forgot your broken foot.
So, with every design that I've created, I start off with this. A design, although most techies might think it starts off with technology because that's where we feel comfortable, it doesn't start off with technology. It starts with business decisions. So make sure that you know your business, you know your business requirements. And from a multi-site perspective, if we look at the influence that we have, if the business is not willing to invest in multi-site, or they don't see the obvious reasons to do so, and they want to stick to a single data center, then you're stuck with that. You'll have to design around that single data center. If the customer is more open to multiple data centers, or your management is more open to multiple data centers, obviously we've got a lot more options there. So this is just a flow chart. It's in the deck, and we'll share that with you, so I don't go through each step individually. But it's good to have a workflow there that help you guide through the business decisions around multi-site deployments as well.
Right, and this is mainly around how you break your site down. If it's active-active, active-passive, active-active pinned, and we'll walk through those.
But again, from a business perspective and not a technology perspective.
Yep.
So, Jarian?
So Citrix deployment types here. So we'll talk about different deployment types going forward right now. So on-premises is the main one. I'm not going to go through each bullet point here, but the main thing is with on-premises, whether you do your primary data centers, your secondary data centers, and so forth, all in-house, you have the most complete control, right? That's the main point to take away from that, is that you have the most control. If something goes wrong, if things go sideways, you can easily find, well, maybe not easily, but you have everything accessible to you to find the root cause analysis, to look at logs, and so forth. The other thing, too, is that image management, so you can automate that using in-house tools. We may have to change them or retrofit them if you go to the cloud or the hybrid model. And the next thing is it's going to be, yes, you'll have higher operational costs, But again, everything is in-house, everything is under your control. So when changes happen, you have more control of that. When things go sideways, you can help find information and so forth. Then we go to the cloud model. Well, maybe you're running everything in the cloud. The cloud is nice. It might be easier onboarding, quicker time to value possibly. But think about troubleshooting is a key point there. You may not have access to everything if something goes down, if things go sideways. A good example is something happens in Azure, like they've happened recently. You may not have full visibility into what happened or why happened. You just know that it's down, and it's causing interruption to your service and to your users. And then look at image management. Image management, you may have to retrofit or change your tools to do any kind of automation that you may have had in-house. And then look at cost. It may not be cost up front, but one thing you have to consider with cost is that cloud is always on, cloud is always charging. So look at things where you have your things that have to be on, make sure those stay on, but then use power management, capacity management to turn things off when they're not in use, when you don't need them.
That is a very, very important point. If you're going to put stuff out in a public cloud, definitely look at your core business hours and definitely look at the workloads you need to run outside of those hours, and everything else that you don't, power it off and make it like more disposable VMs. And
Pet versus kettle.
Yes,
Yep.
We had a slide about it, but we don't have time to.
And then look at your cost here. Another thing is that yes, we're offloading, having to manage infrastructure, having to manage certain things, so that operating cost goes down, but doesn't mean you're going to save money. Think about if an outage happens, what does that cost to your business when you're going everything in the cloud? And then we look at something like Citrix Cloud, where it's a hybrid model, where we have our infrastructure in-house or in the cloud, and only the workloads on-prem. And think about that to where you're not having that day two operations of patching your SQL, patching your controllers, maintaining all the infrastructure. You're more worried about the cloud connectors on, in your locations and so forth. Now, troubleshooting, you do bring some back because you have some things in-house to where you can still troubleshoot, find logging, look for that root cause analysis, but you may not have all the logs available if something happens in the control plane, or again, if something like Azure goes down, and how that impacts your environments. Image management, this is going to be more tied closer to on-premises because you can still use those same tools in-house. And then cost, again, cloud outages will happen, so you have to calculate and plan for failure. And then hardware and core components.
So these are things that might not be under your control, right? If you're the desktop team or the Citrix team, you might not have control on hardware, but we'll go over them anyway because I think it's important to ask. Like even if you don't have the control, go to your hardware team, go to your networking team, go to the data center team if there's a specific data center team. Ask them about these things, right? Be aware because we can design around these items, but we have to be aware. And items here are protect against failure. So have multiple power circuits. Try to eliminate failure as much as possible. Go through each of your individual components that you have and try to figure out if they're a single point of failure or not. And if they're a single point of failure, see how you can get them in an HA state. And obviously connectivity, and this is from outside or from inside outside. So I've seen situations where the business went down because their internet circuit from inside out went down because of somebody cutting a cable. Keep that in mind, have multiple paths. And that goes for the services as well. But again, you might not have control over these services, like your core networking, like your supporting infra, DHCP, AD, DNS. They might be, you might consume them as a utility or as water or electricity, but it doesn't mean that if you fail over to another site, these services are there or responding in a similar way. So keep asking those teams. And obviously you need to replicate your data across multiple sites as well, because the whole core functionality of desktop virtualization or application virtualization is bringing apps and data close together, and it does not make sense, like Dave said, to have data in one region and have your apps in the other because you're introducing latency there. And the third one is think about your core design. Think about your networking, but not just on an access path, but also on your server networking and maybe your storage networking. Have multiple paths. Have them redundant. And the same goes for power paths. So have multiple power circuits, have your equipment hooked up to the different power circuits as well.
Even multiple power grids too. So you don't want to have everything for your data centers in the same power grid or down the street or a couple miles away, because if that area, some natural disaster happens and you lose power for a sustained amount of time, that's a problem right there. And so that's why we look at these cloud data centers, Azure, AWS, GCP, they've got them in totally different regions and totally different power grids to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah, and even generators can get you
Yep.
just so far.
Yep.
So that's a very good point you're making there. Dave, about networking.
Yeah, let's talk about networking a bit. Three things. Networking is going to underpin your platform. If you've got a bad network, if it's a slow network, like hands up who's had the Citrix is broken. And then hands up who has then gone to their network team and said, oh, is there any issues? And it's like, yeah, there's a bit of a network that's down, we're working on it. Yeah.
Or they
And
just say
fixed.
it's a Citrix issue.
So, and that's the point, is you need to make sure your network is good, is solid, but not only, this is not just about PCs talking to each other over a wire, it's about traffic manipulation, especially in a multi-site environment. So when data comes into a region, you need to manipulate that traffic based on criteria to whether it's go to data center A, region A, data center B, and your network is key for that to happen. So if we look at design, this is fundamental to a resilient performant platform. Like it says up there, a networking failure often gets tagged as Citrix is broken. It's not always the case, but quite often it is. Like Kay said, allow for multiple paths where possible. Be aware if there's network segmentation happening in your environment, and also if you are pushing network segmentation into multiple regions, those rules need to be defined up front or you're going to have an absolute nightmare. Be aware of the cloud, so be aware of how networking works in AWS or the VNets up in Azure or GCP, and plan. Have your network planned out before you start to go down the multi-site path. Resilience is, like I said earlier, it's going to be key. You need to provide multiple paths, not only in your data center, between them. And that's whether it's data centers that you own, whether you're going from an on-premises data center up to the cloud, even to the point of the hypervisors that you've got in your rack. So have a couple of core switches at the top, have them on separate power rings, have a couple of cables in each node, make sure they go to different core switches, and provide resilience within the DC and then also across DC. And there's tools to help you with that. SD-WAN. Use that, combine the network paths together and make it more resilient between your data centers so that from a multi-site perspective, stuff's always going to be on. And lastly, technology. So vendors, there is loads and loads of vendors out there that offer technology to help you with delivering multi-site Citrix deployments. Now, obviously, F5 is up there, AVI Networks. For most of you who know me, you know I'm a Citrix guy. So most of the rest of this presentation will be based around ADCs and how you can use, from a networking point of view, how you can use an ADC to help you with multi-site by way of using load balancing, like using GeoIP databases to route people to the right location, using GSLB to do traffic management between your data centers. You wanted to say something about Microsoft?
Yeah, so Microsoft also, in later OS versions on the server side, you have DNS policies too that can do some DNS traffic manipulation and help you with some application load balancing and failover. So if anything, there's no excuse not to have any kind of traffic management in your environments.
Yep.
Right, so one of the choices in that whole stack, as we saw, was Hypervisor for your multi-site deployments as well. And maybe it's something that we have to go through to get you understanding why we're mentioning this. So looking at the hypervisors that Citrix currently support, it's the artist formerly known as Zen Server. See, it worked.
Yeah. Nice job, that was good. Nice pause too, you executed perfectly, that was good.
Microsoft Hyper-V, VMware vSphere, and there's Nutanix AHV. And these are the hypervisors that are supported on premises in your data center. Now, the items that we typically consider when selecting a hypervisor, are quite broad, right? It's cost, it's management. Think about some of these hypervisors will have a single point of failure in their management infrastructure, like managing the hypervisor itself. A couple of these, like SCVMM or vCenter, will be your single point of failure in your architecture, where Citrix does a little bit smarter with the master in a pool. If that goes down, there's an election and another master becomes, well, another member of the pool becomes a master. So your infrastructure management is always there, and you're always able to kind of influence the rest of the infrastructure. Obviously, adoption is a key item. Look at community support, look at people around you that are adopting these hypervisors, talk to them, make sure you're comfortable there. Performance, obviously, we work for a team that does a lot around performance. So performance is one of the items that we typically touch upon when we look at hypervisor selection. And specifically more to this session, availability, ecosystem, and feature set are important for your multi-site design. So is your hypervisor able to span across multiple sites? Is your management plane able to span across multiple sites? What's the ecosystem looks like? Do you need tools like Veeam or Zerto to do data replication from your hypervisor to a secondary site?
Or Nutanix.
These guys don't know anything about it.
Yeah.
And also looking at feature sets, like having span clusters, or if you're looking at GPUs, think about that as well. So selecting your hypervisor during a multi-site design is one of the key features here. And obviously update cycles would apply here as well, because with all the stuff that Intel has been pulling off lately, you might want to consider something that is updated on a regular basis and has those patches across those multiple sites.
Great. All right, pass it off. Thank you, sir. Thank you for a well-executed handoff. So we're going to talk just very briefly about security design and delegation so we can pick things up and you actually get into the meat of the presentation. I just went back. Let's go forward. So basically, 3 key areas here, just growth, delegation, and rights. It's all really around a couple key areas. Usually, when I've seen this a couple times going into customer environments, you go in and from an architectural perspective, you go in, either you hire a consultant or you do it internally, you build this beautiful design for your first site, ready to go, and then all of a sudden the business comes down the line and they're like, hey, we got to expand. We're either moving hybrid to the cloud or we're getting a secondary data center, and some of those initial concepts that you were so stoked on for design, like security, rights, and delegation, are forgotten about. So you want to make sure you prevent organic growth like that and take the time to look at the business considerations, look at proper roles, assignments, et cetera, but not just across Citrix, right, and catalogs and delegation there. You want to look at all the other areas like replication, your profile, StoreFront, ADC, OU, GPOs, Citrix policies, all those areas in the stack you want to look at. And really just keep that focus around least privilege and delegation. That should be your #1 focus when you're giving rights out in general. And just want to mention real quick here is, so delegation was something, and configuration logging was added fairly recently in Citrix Cloud. It was something that was missing for a while. So right now they do have delegated rights. It's single user today. It's not group based, but how fast they're iterating, it's only a matter of time before that's added. So just FYI on that. So now what we're going to get into is site design. I got 3 guys looking at me like, all right, is this guy going to stay on track? I feel the heat coming from the right.
Stay on target.
So the first concept we're going to talk about is failure domains. I'll go through this fairly quickly, but it's very important. And in fact, we actually put this in here for a failure domain for the failure domain, because actually I think one of you guys was supposed to talk about failure domains, but now we have this in here, which is a failure domain for that topic. See that? See what I did there? So basically, failure domains are basically a logical or physical grouping of architectural components that you basically evaluate against risk, right? So what do you consider from a risk perspective? I'll give you an example, right? From a site design standpoint, that's what we're talking about. You might have, let's say, an epic deployment, right? And maybe you can do it, and you have 2 physical sites, and they're geolocated very closely, dark fiber, et cetera. Hey, for that, in that perspective, it makes sense. Let's do a single site, maybe do multi-zone, and split SQL across the 2. We're good to go. But from a fault domain perspective, when you go to do an update, there's risk involved, right? If you update and there's a failure in the database, you take the whole site down, right? So obviously with Epic, they recommend separate sites. Or if you're doing internal failure domains, if you have that scenario basically where you want to have, say, 15,000 users, you don't want 15,000 users on a single site. You want to split those out to like a pod-based architecture where you have your workloads, maybe your control services and SQL in separate pods of 5,000, for instance.
Yeah, for example, a rack could be a failure domain.
Yeah,
right, Ryan?
Yep. Yep. Yeah. So, and then you want to plan and expect failures. But does anyone kind of curious why we put a monkey on the slide there? Anybody have an idea? What's that? Your business? Monkey business. So it's basically a chaos monkey. I don't know if anyone's heard of that, if they messed around with DevOps or whatever, but back in 2011, and Netflix had a major outage in AWS, and they said, we're never going to let this happen again. So they went and built some really hardcore scripts to proactively go through all aspects of their infrastructure. It started as just a chaos monkey, and they built a whole, what they call the chaos army, but it basically proactively filled live parts of the infrastructure during the day. And they basically, from that, they learned how to proactively, constantly, iterate their infrastructure to plan against failure. So if you're gonna fail, you want to fail fast and learn from that.
Just about those failure domains, just going back to that point, obviously technology is evolving and it's allowing us to grow bigger, faster.
Yes. Yeah, it's not just
It might
Citrix.
not make sense to look at the biggest pod you can get. So depending on your requirements, you might want to slim that down. And we've got examples where people were using pods of 32 nodes or 32 servers going back because their maintenance window was growing out of control, or they couldn't keep their maintenance within that maintenance window. So having all that power, and especially from like a CPU, RAM, and disk perspective, we're getting more and more power. We can cram more and more users on a box, but you might want to consider if that's a smart thing. So keep an eye on your failure domains when you're deploying that and sizing this out.
Yeah, same thing on virtualization management infrastructure like vCenter and things like that, right? Those can be single points of failure. So, sorry guys. I know these guys had like this strict design plan on the deck, certain colors. So I threw this donut slide in here because I'm sorry. I think it's funny because I really enjoy gourmet donuts, and I think that when you're talking about know your workload, right? It's really like a box of donuts, an assortment of donuts. Your workloads have all different characteristics, and my favorite is the red velvet donut and if you look at that from our layers, you could say like the cream cheese is the presentation layer, and maybe the ingredients or the resource layer. And I don't know, I'm just kidding. I just want to put the slide in there for fun. So what do you mean by know your workloads, right? I was totally not going to go through a stack of donuts, but a key thing here is your workload is split across multiple sites. Typically, that's what we're talking about, multi-site design, right? So you got to understand how your workload is split across sites. Things that come into play there are you have localized applications. You might have legacy applications on site. Your application might have identity that's federated through either Okta, Azure AD, Ping, et cetera, other services. Your presentation layer is Citrix, which is what we're talking about, but the workload is so critical. You have SaaS applications of different types of apps. Maybe you have infrastructure as a workload, service provider applications, but really that middle center stack is the things that you have to think about when you're talking about your workload, right? And that's going to determine if you're active-active or active-active pinned, right? Where you're basically both data centers are live and active, but you're pinning certain users to the data center where it makes sense, right? So things you want to look at is your app tier, your web tier, file services, SQL services, network from a ports and protocol perspective, whitelist, blacklist, that sort of stuff. These are all things you got to think about in identity as well. So it's very important to take the time to understand your workloads. And when you take that, and once you understand your workload, you want to look at your site design. Are you going to do a single site? Are you going to do multi-site with zones? How does that all break out? So we threw this little flow chart together, and we made it super small so you couldn't read in the back. So I can say anything I want now. It doesn't matter. But basically, it's a couple key questions. I'm not going to run through this each of these boxes because we want to move on and get to the demos and the fun stuff. But we wanted to break. We sat for a long time. We said, what are key questions that can help us make the design decision? So, for instance, do you have more than one DC? Yes or no? Do you need internal failure domains? And then the last question, once you go through that, is basically, do you need we want to weigh management costs and resilience. And based on that, you're going to help determine what that layout looks like. And that whole design process really goes away when you're talking about Citrix Cloud because the multiple site scenario and SQL aspect is gone, right? Now you're just talking about multiple physical sites, but those are where really resource locations, which are those right there where your cloud connectors would go. So site design, this is kind of logically what it would look like. I'll go through this fairly quickly here. So site design, the first one on the left is kind of, and we threw some geographic stuff on it, kind of put some perspective, but single site, multi-zone, Miami, New York, LA, different zones. SQL could either be in Miami or you might split SQL, again, depends on the latency. on how you do that, and we'll talk through SQL in a second, so I don't want to steal from thunder from there. Single DC multi-site, that's that internal failure domain. If you need that internal failure domain, it would look like what's below, where you have 3 physical sites, but your access layer, which Dave is going to drive through, so I won't steal the thunder there, you're going to aggregate things like resources and stuff like that to have, so you don't have multiple icons and stuff like that. Multi-site primary zone, so that's basically single site, 2 separate physical sites, again, do an aggregation, and then you can actually do multi-site, multi-zone with that hub spoke design, which is USA, nice and big there, and then you have the other site that's over in EMEA, right, with different zones.
Well, we had a discussion about that because I put in Europe.
Yeah.
Dave is from the UK, so he's going to exit Europe, so we had to do EMEA.
EMEA instead.
We'll see how we fare, and we'll update it next time. So let's talk about SQL. So we're really going to focus time-wise on basic always-on availability groups. It was something that was fairly recently introduced into SQL. I think it was SQL 2016, SQL standard, right? So basically, main difference between that and always-on availability groups is basic always-on availability, same fundamental infrastructure as far as requiring SQL clustering. You have, but the main difference there is your actual listener, right? You have a single listener per database versus where always-on availability group you can have one listener and multiple databases and fail them all over in sets. With basic always on, each one is kind of handled differently. And a key thing there that also was a development as time progressed was you had to have a file share witness previously. So you had to have that third data center in a multi-subnet design, and if you didn't have that, then you can have challenges with quorum because you had the file share witness. So they recently added Azure Witness as well. So basically, which is kind of neat, it's a little storage blob there, and it acts as a third witness, so you don't need that third data center. But the key thing on this slide to talk about here that I've seen a lot of folks miss when we go in and do a lot of health checks is if you don't set the multi-subnet failover string on the connection string on those databases, you're going to have challenges when you go to failover, because if you think about it, when you have multiple 2 subnets on a listener, those are 2 separate IP addresses that are registering into DNS, and a traditional application that doesn't understand how to handle multi-subnet are going to respond back with different IP addresses. So this string allows the application to understand on which one's actually active. So be sure to set that. And we'll talk about the reason why you would want to set the why you'd want to set, actually, we set that for localhost cache modes. When you go to localhost cache with non-provisioned pooled machines on how to operate correctly there with localhost cache.
The other thing, Shane, before you move on,
I kept talking. I thought you guys
when you're doing the basic availability groups and you've got they sit on top of a Windows cluster, and if one of your nodes is in your local data center and you're using another one up in a cloud resource, make sure you add the IPs to the interfaces for your bag failover IPs in Azure. Because whilst Windows clustering will look like it's come up, you won't be able to get there. And we had this in the lab. You're trying to get to it, and the cloud tenant doesn't know about the IPs, so just make sure you put them on there before you fail over.
Yep, that's a great point, and we actually walked through that here in the video. So what we're going to do is we're going to hit our first video. It's 20 minutes long, and we're going to walk through it of a SQL failover demo. So here we go. So courtesy of the cool bumper here of Case, very cool. 7 seconds allows me to do my moves. So what we're talking about here is our SQL design. So basically we have it split between UK libhook and Azure UK South. We have 2 nodes in our failover cluster, and you can see each of the bags that are actually a part of this. Sorry it's so blurry. I want to make sure everyone needs glasses after this. You can see your cloud witness that's over here. Oh, damn it.
Stop clicking.
Do that. Oh,
Go back once.
Me.
Give me the clicker.
All right, take the clicker away. I was trying to hit the laser.
Fast forward a little bit. Again, 7 seconds. Go.
Okay, so basically what I'm showing here, I showed the cloud witness. I'm showing each of the basic always-on availability groups on SQL 01. You can basically see that we have inside of each database or each always-on availability group, we have the listener. The listener has an IP address on each subnet, right? We have the port 1433. The other thing you'll notice, and those will register, each of those listener names become names in DNS. And that way, that's how it's able to register from an application perspective. And on the database, you have either synchronous or asynchronous. Synchronous is important to know that it requires the write to happen on the other side and acknowledge it. So if you're split between 2 physical locations, if you do synchronous for automatic failover, you're going to see that the console is actually pretty slow, right? Depending on where your primary is or when it fails over. So I'm just kind of showing there that it's split between the 2 sites and the bag on the second end. And this is important. What Dave was talking about is SQL 02 that's in Azure. We're actually showing on networking and on the actual physical interface in Azure. You can actually see the IP configurations. You have to go and define those additional IPs for each of the basic on availability group listeners as well as the cluster IP. And if that's not set, shit's going to break. It's not going to work. So these are we can skip ahead just a little bit here, but this website, this is that CTX article I talked about. This is talking through a set of scripts for changing your connection strings in the case of failure, or where you need to set, in this case, the multi-subnet availability script. So you basically, it's just a PowerShell script, you kick it off, it goes to all the controllers, it enumerates them, and it'll actually go ahead and set that string to true versus false, and then it preps it and makes sure it's ready and available for a multi-site design. You can skip ahead a little bit. So let's go ahead and make it fail. Right, so we're going to skip ahead, super fast computer Dave's got in the lab, bam, all right, here we go. So SQL 1, we're going to go into Prism, we're going to go to SQL 1 and we're going to shut it down. Right, SQL 1 just took a dive, it's dead. If you go into the cluster failover, we can take a look at the actual nodes, and we can see that SQL 1 is down hard, users are pissed off, SQL's down, but they don't know about it, right? Why don't they know about it? Because the bags failed over seamlessly, or synchronously, right, over to Azure. So let's go ahead and kick up Studio. Studio by design it's going to be a little bit slow starting up. Also, Dave assigned 1 gig of RAM to the VM. He's super skimpy on resources, so we'll skip ahead here and see SQL launch, and obviously SQL is going to come up fine. But what I want to show here is just in SQL 2, you can see when we kick that open, you're going to see your basic always on availability groups are now set to primary, and everything failed over successfully. So it's pretty awesome. So just wanted to show that and how it was split between on-prem and Azure. I think we covered that pretty well there. So let's pass it off from a licensing design standpoint.
Right, so
cool.
We're going to rattle through a few bits now. Licensing. You need licensing, obviously, for Citrix to work. You've got a decision to make at this point, whether you're going to use Citrix Cloud or whether you're going to use traditional on-premises licensing. We'll deal with on-premises first. So there are Citrix license file restrictions, i.e. you can't issue the same license twice to 2 different servers and have them live unless they're the same name, which causes an issue if they're on the domain. There was chat about a parallel use agreement with some people, but we're not going to get into that. So you have options around either clustering or load balancing. Load balancing, you can have 2 machines, the same name off domain in worker groups, and issue the licenses once, put it on both things, and then run active-passive with a Citrix ADC in front of it. Or you can have a Windows cluster and issue the license files to the cluster name, which will then put it on both nodes, and then you can use the Windows cluster to fail over. Make sure you replace certificates on the license servers, not in one place, but in 2, for the web services and the licensing services. There's 2 places you need to replace it. The reason you do that is so that when there's a failure, and when it drops from one site to another, you won't need to go into all your services and get Citrix Studio to retrust the license server. You know that little box? Yes, I trust it. You won't get that. Monitor all the services, all the service ports, so 2700, 7279, all of those ports. Make sure you monitor all 4 and fail over if a single port goes down. ADNS, authoritative DNS services, make sure the TTL on, if you're using GSLB, Global Server Load Balancing, make sure the TTL is really low on the DNS record. 30-day grace period. So this is quite an important one. There was a failure recently where we had the licenses installed on an active node. It was running in an active-passive pair. The certificates had been replaced. Everything was good. We didn't have the licenses on the secondary node, assuming that in the event of a failure, it will drop over. We get 30-day grace, we'll bang the licenses on there, happy days. As soon as it failed over, obviously Citrix is like, no, there's no failure because your GSLB is handling all that. Where's all the licenses gone? Everyone's like, bang, everything's down. So if you are doing active-passive, have the same server name off domain in a group with the licenses on both. Because if there's a failover, Citrix won't know about it and it won't trigger the grace period. With clustering, that's not an issue. We did have a demo here. We've taken it out purely because of time. We are going to put all the demos we recorded online, and we'll get them to you somehow. So this is the way we would typically set up active-passive ADNS. Active-passive licenses. You have ADNS in both sites. Reason for that is if you lose a whole site, ADNS can still respond from the other site. Citrix ADC sitting up front. Monitors going on, monitoring the license server, having an active-passive, one being on-premises and the other one being in Azure. And if you lose one, it fails over to the other. So, Citrix Cloud. All of that problem goes away if you use Citrix Cloud. It's a service that you access and is managed from your Citrix Cloud control pane. It's accessed, as you can see there, through My Services and licensing and usage. Usage reporting is built in. So you get that nice, pretty graph out the box, and it's a pay-as-you-grow. So you can, as you get more users, you can just add them up to your license server, and that's it. That's licensing. Moving on, access layer. First one.
The fire hose.
Yeah, StoreFront versus Citrix Workspace. Again, at this point, you've got a decision to make, on-premises or Citrix Cloud. And which one do you choose? Well, the direction you go here will change the way you look at how you deploy this in a multi-site environment. What is StoreFront? It is, according to this, an enterprise application store. Basically, it provides your users access to your virtual apps and desktops remotely. It is one of the single most important things you're going to manage in your environment because it's what your users touch every single time they consume a service from you. If you bugger this up, they're going to moan a lot. So it needs to be always on. It needs to be quick. You need to be able to move it around your data centers, and the users all need to be able to get to it. Some of the things you need to consider in a multi-site deployment of StoreFront. Like I said, it's a user interaction point. Considerations about a subscripted store versus a mandatory store. So a subscripted store is where you log on, you get apps, desktops, you click on the favorites, and they go to your favorites link. Mandatory store, they're all just there. If you have a subscripted store and you have separate server groups for your StoreFront servers in the different regions, if you get a failover and you haven't catered for the subscription database in StoreFront, the user will log on in the event of a failover and see that, and none of their applications will be displayed. There's an article up there where you can use PowerShell to synchronize the subscription database between StoreFront server groups. If your latency is low enough, you can run a server group straight across all of the locations you have, and the subscription database will, the synchronization will be taken care for you.
Also important is that last write wins.
Yes,
right.
Last write win is very important. So if you are doing manual sync and you fail over from data center A to data center B, and then everyone there, adds their applications, and you're still syncing only that one way, then it will overwrite it with what it was here. You need to consider that. It's kind of similar to profiles. Stored multiple versus single server groups. Like I said earlier, you can have one that spans. The other thing you can do is you can have two stores on one StoreFront server and point them both to the same subscription database. There's an article up there which will show you how to do that. Icon consolidation, something else you need to think about. So if you have multiple sets of delivery groups attached to the StoreFront service, then you're going to get what you see up on screen there. You're going to get two icons to run the same application. The users aren't going to like that. So under resource aggregation, you can add your aggregated controller groups in there, assign your users to that, and then they get a single icon, and StoreFront will handle where to run that from. Optimal gateway routing, this is another thing. OGR works like when a user hits a gateway, when they click an icon, StoreFront will give it back the location of the Netscaler gateway or the ADC gateway in the data center closest to the application. You can have multiple OGRs, so we have one here for LibHook and one for Azure UK South. When you click on an icon, it will send the user direct to that data center and then back down to their applications. So it means you get the most performant thing. Something to consider here is putting GSLB in front of your optimal gateway routes, so that whilst it will always go to the primary data center, in the event of a failure, it will go to the other one. Performance won't quite be as good, but you don't lose a service.
Failure, yeah.
Other things to consideration, that is what you don't want your users to see ever. So know what happens during a failure, test it, switch things off, refresh the page, see what happens, see what the behavior is like. Local site load balancing, so within data center load balancing and GSLB across, and the reason identity is up there. So using ADFS as an example, if you have ADFS in data center A and you have a highly resilient StoreFront in data center A and data center B, but you don't do the same with ADFS and you lose this side, StoreFront's great. It fails over, everyone can get there as soon as they try and log on, because the identity platform isn't made multi-site aware underneath, you won't be able to log on to your applications. So this is a StoreFront demo, which I'm going to skip because we're getting tight.
Your timekeeper,
I'll put this
man.
up.
You got to speed up, I guess, right?
There's an active StoreFront demo with failures where we failed between on-premise and Azure. Cloud hosted.
Middle of the deck stretch. All right, everybody get up. We're going to do the YMCA, do some backflips, do up. All right, here we go. Why? Wow, everyone really got up. I told you we should have played the music.
Okay, moving on.
You guys are supposed to get in on this. All right, all right. It helps us from a time standpoint. We know where we're at.
Citrix Workspace is a service hosted by Citrix. It's not only virtual apps and desktops. You have SaaS applications, you have applications that you can host within your data center, like web apps that you can host in your data center, and you can have on-premises virtual apps and desktops and Citrix Cloud. It's going to use a custom workspace URL like domain.cloud.com. You can change that. Get in there early if you want it, because otherwise it's the same as registering a DNS. Other people might have already nicked it. It's a service provided by the Citrix control plane, so it's always going to be on. It's always going to be there. It's never going to go down, ever, because Citrix are running it. And it will always be there, so all is good in that camp. And the reason I mention that is because you don't need to worry about multi-site delivery of Citrix Workspace. Citrix are worrying about that for you. What you do need to worry about is the connectivity into your resource locations from the Citrix Workspace. That's something you need to worry about. Citrix worry about making this service available all the time.
Yeah, from a design decision standpoint, is you know, if you want to have localized failure, right, for apps and desktops, you need to have StoreFront, NetScaler on-prem. Workspace doesn't provide that functionality today.
You can use AD plus token as your AD, or the new additions, so Okta and everything else that they announced in the keynote earlier, which will offload to servers, and I did get authorization that that is allowed to be spoken about. There is limited branding, so if your company is heavy on branding StoreFront, you may not get what you want from Citrix Workspace. And there is so many more integrations on this and so much more security and everything. Like, this is like StoreFront on steroids, but it's a Citrix Cloud option. Moving on, remote access. Again, decision time. On-premises, Citrix Cloud. On-premises, you have a Citrix Unified Gateway, runs on ADC. You can run it on Azure, AWS, GCP, physical appliance, or as a virtual appliance within your data center. Consider the difference when you're deploying it as the differences between Citrix Gateway and Citrix Unified Gateway. If you want SaaS or web apps internally to be presented from multiple regions, make sure you consider that. Ticketing is something you need to also consider, because if you have tickets from a single data center and you fail over, or those ticketing servers go down, you need to have multi-data center presence for your ticketing on your unified gateways. Authentication, the same applies for Unified Gateway Auth as it does for StoreFront. You need to have that available in multiple regions if you're going to fail this over. Themes and RF Web UI, that was to make sure, because you're pretty much going to manage these independently, make sure it looks the same. It's something really simple, but if you get, like, if all your users are working on this side, suddenly it fails, and then they come in the next day and you've got like the default black NetScaler theme on there. They're going to be like, what's going on? So just make sure that's the same across both of it.
That's just your
yeah, it is. Yeah. Right, cloud-hosted Citrix Gateway service is a highly resilient multi-cloud service that is, again, provided by Citrix. So you don't need to worry about how to make this multi-site aware. They've done it for you. It's a simplified version of the Gateway module. It's a platform as a service offered by Citrix Cloud. There's nothing to configure on it. It's on by default when you sign up to Citrix Cloud. It's got 12 currently, I think, although maybe that was changed to 13 global points of presence. Last time I checked, it was 12. You can configure Citrix virtual apps and desktops and SaaS apps to run through the Citrix Gateway service.
Get a drink, Dave.
Yeah.
So monitoring is important from of course monitoring is important because you want to know what goes down, when it goes down, and so forth. Either try to be proactive or reactive very quickly. So the first thing we'll talk about is Citrix Director. I'm not going to go through all this, but the main thing here is that it's included, it's free based on your entitlement. You may have longer retention lengths, shorter retention lengths. You may have application probing, which can help you kind of stay ahead of the curve of trying to see if applications are available or having problem. The main thing I want to say here is that if you're doing load balanced or multiple director servers, make sure your customizations are deployed on all of your director nodes. Also, too, if you're doing any custom filters, make sure you copy those across all your nodes. They won't be there, or point them in the same site to a central location, and so forth. When you configure director in the discovery address, you can point that to a GSLB address. By default, it wants you to point to one controller per site. The nice thing is, though, is that once it talks to that controller, it does some caching, and if that controller goes down, it will still function in later versions from testing that we've been doing. But again, you can also point this to a GSLB address, and then for another site, do a comma, and then do another GSLB address. That way you don't have to worry about it doing that caching or have that automatic, or have that failover. You can do and control that with GSLB.
Just quickly touching on ADM and how this would work in a multi-site deployment. So this is also, it's free, so why would you not use it? Deploy an ADC, put an ADM right next to it, and use the application delivery management to monitor things across your multi-site platform. What we often do is create non-addressable virtual servers to monitor things that aren't within your control, for example, SQL. You want to know if SQL's working because you're reliant on it, but you may not have the access to monitor it. So just set up a non-addressable virtual server on your Netscaler to check it. Any event that Netscaler or that ADC generates is going to go to the ADM. So then create a rule on the ADM that says if you pick up this alert because the SQL server's gone down, then tell us. And it's a way of using this to monitor things in multiple regions. The only thing, it's got a floating IP, so you'll probably need 2 HA pairs, 1 in each data center, unless you have a massive network. And you can run the IP across both. You can monitor a lot of stuff for nothing from one of these.
So user persona is important because if your end users don't have their stuff, they're going to call and do help desk generating events, ticket events, and so forth. So the first thing we're talking about is Workspace Environment Management.
Yep, yeah, we're going to go through this fairly quickly here. So Workspace Environment Management is kind of inherently multi-site capable built in based on how the infrastructure brokers work. So you can still have a SQL database. It can be basic always on or always on availability groups. It does have a localized cache, so from a multi-site standpoint, that helps in the case that you have an availability issue. You still have a localized cache that'll work there. From a GSLB perspective, we're going to look at now on how we can use GSLB active passive in each data center, separate broker load balance URLs basically, or host names, and then do failover on the other side to basically make you always on availability, essentially always on there. Key thing we want to look at here is basically designing your OU structure and your configuration sets accordingly. So if you have a good OU structure built out, you have that OU structure built out inside a WEM, and then what we talked about, different host names for each of the sites. You then apply the GPO, set that broker host name basically for that GSLB URL in that specific site. You'll always broker, so you have localized brokering that's happening. If there's an issue, then it would broker that way, right? So that's kind of cool. You can do that, and consider looking at using for UPM. You could possibly use UPM. You can use UPM for that as well. Most recently, I mean, they're not 100% in lockstep to where the UPM releases are. So if you want to be on the latest version of UPM, I'd still consider doing UPM management outside of WEM, but it depends on your specific scenario. So taking a look at one thing that was kind of neat that we did on a recent deployment is using location variable paths. So for instance, this is where you start using the technology that's built into WEM to kind of do some neat stuff for multi-site. So if we take a look at the 2 data centers, we have CTX data for the DFS namespace. And we have two locations for the print server variable, right? So the print server is another thing for high availability. How do we handle that across 2 sites, right? So what we did is we've looked at CTX data for the variable. If we look at the actual variable name, it's CTX data libhook, and that's basically the actual namespace for DFSN, right? So we have 2 DFSN namespaces for DFS. If we look at the print server, you can see the name there. So print server is a variable, but we have the actual Azure UK print server. But the key here is the conditional access, right? Or the condition for the filter where we're doing it by IP or subnet base. So that way, if we log on to that VDA over in the secondary site in UK South, it does it, WEM runs, oh, I'm part of this. Go ahead and map the correct print server and map the correct profiles. If you take a look at the actual action for the printer, you can see / print server / the actual session name.
Shane, stop.
There was no time for this.
Someone point out Shane's glaring error on that slide.
Yep,
He
there you
got
go.
the wrong
Bingo.
session number.
Whatever.
He put the wrong session
That's how we
number
make
on
sure
the
you're all
slide.
paying attention, all right? So basically in SYN217, that's what's going to be next year, I'm thinking ahead, is you have your filter for the libhook site as well as your environment variables are going to be attached from an action perspective, but then you have your filters that are assigned to that. So that way, and then you have your DFS namespaces, as I said. And this basically will allow you to have, you can have DFSR technically from a replication perspective, but the key when you're doing DFSR for profiles, they would say, Microsoft doesn't support it, the key is you have a single target, right? And you have to pin them to those separate data centers. You can't be active at the same time. You can have replication, but you got to make sure you're on a single target, and this is how you can make sure that that happens with the variables there. So failover design, we'll just go through this here. So basically, and I already talked through it pretty much, but just doing the load balancing, GSLB, having a separate host name set up for each site, and then do active passive GSLB on that host name, and then separate GPOs, which we'll look at actually in a few minutes when we talk about VDA design.
So Citrix user persona management. So you have a couple options here. First, the built-in options with Microsoft, but honestly, after Microsoft has purchased FSLogix, we shouldn't be seeing roaming profiles as much anymore in the field. Everyone should look into FSLogix, or with Citrix, you are entitled to UPM. But then you look at the hybrid solution, which with UPM, a combination of files and VHDX files, and then fully container-based, things like user layers and FSLogix. The main thing, though, when you get to these VHDX containers, since they're always being read and written to, you have to think about how you're going to make those redundant. FSLogix has the feature called Cloud Cache, but then things like user layers or the VHDX and UPM, you can't just copy those at any time because they're being written to all the time, so you have to think about other ways to handle that. Some of the other things to think about when you want to do user persona options, everyone wants active-active, but honestly, active-active is pretty much a pipe dream. Usually it's more of an active-active pin or active-passive. Unless you have every user in your environment do mandatory profiles, then active-active is real. But if you're doing any kind of user persona, active-passive across multiple sites is, honestly, to me, is a pipe dream. Anybody else agree with that? So it is a pipe dream. So, but in these solutions where it's hybrid and so forth, last write wins. You do have some replication methods built in. Like I said, Cloud Cache has theirs. We can use third-party products. The key thing here is that one thing I've been testing is a software called Peer Software Replication. And so doing things like user layers or even FSLogix or anything that has VHDX containers built into it, those can replicate on the fly and only do the delta changes across in a active fashion. So you can get there. The nice thing with Peer is that it can do source and target the same solution, mixed solutions, and so forth, and it supports all those. I was going to go through and do a demo, but in the interest of time, we'll post this again and show you actually an active-active with Peer Software of user layers in an environment across 2 data centers, but that will be in our demo that we'll post. So we're going to do VDAs next.
Okay, cool. So VDAs, that's really your workloads, right? This is important, right? So when you're talking about Citrix Cloud, right, the control planes handle up there. VDAs is what's in your data center or in your resource location, right? This is the meat of what you own. This is your workloads, your apps, all that fun stuff. But there's more than that, right? What we're going to talk about is VDA registration, how to protect against controller and site failures. We're going to talk about VDA design from catalogs, delivery group, app groups, and multi-site concepts. And then we're going to look at VDA policies. So policies not so much for just Citrix, but we're going to look at Active Directory, we're going to look at GPOs. And this is at a high level. Again, each of these things, we could probably spend 90 minutes on each one of these topics, but hopefully at least some of this is helping out and how we broke things down. So Citrix policies and what that looks like from multi-site. So registration failure concepts, a couple of key things on how do you register for, what are the options for registering a VDA, right? So you have policy-based, so that's basically where you have local policy, right? So local GPO-based policy, or you have a GPO that actual Active Directory-based GPO, so local or Active Directory that has the highest priority. Registry-based, so that could be conditional access-based. So if you have, we actually did this recently for a customer when we were migrating them to Citrix Cloud. The condition piece, so we did the list of DDCs and we did a condition based on the computer name of the actual VDA. So we had percentages of the VDAs slowly registered with Citrix Cloud connectors. And there were, in a separate image and catalog and that sort of thing. So you can do that there as well. Legacy is the old AD method, and then MCS has the ability to do the personality.ini. Most folks are doing, most folks don't realize, but they have auto update enabled, and they're just kind of, when they go install the VDA, next, they put their VDA in, and they're actually using auto update, which we'll talk about what that means.
Install next.
Yeah, that's how we do the install these days, man. Everything's automated. It's beautiful, man. Come on. So install next, read a little bit, then hit next. But yeah, so that's for VDA registration, right? So if you look at the registration concept, so there's a lot of concepts, but what are the ones that specifically affect multi-site is the auto-update controller settings. So that's basically what happens there is when you actually put in your controllers, it's actually talking to the primary controller in the primary zone at that point. It's actually going in and caching in a local file. I forgot the name of the file. It basically has a SID of each of the controllers, so everything's cached locally. So if there is a controller that goes down or new controllers are out of the site, technically it's auto-updating, right? So there's some value there, but also that can have some downside in cases where you want to do things like controller grouping, where you want to do localized VDA registrations, where you maybe want to say this particular zone, I want to make sure all my VDAs in this zone go to these 2 VDAs, and then maybe in the case of a failure, that third, I'll have you put brackets around those, and maybe in the case you have a third controller that would go to the primary zone or whatnot. If you're doing controller grouping and you end up doing that, key thing there is you want to disable the auto-update setting because that will actually interfere and it will basically take precedence over what you're doing with controller grouping. Always on brokering. This is a kind of a cool concept that was, I guess, pioneered by Hal. I don't know if he's in the room anywhere, but
oh, there he is. Let's see
look at
the
that.
hand.
There he is. So he had kind of pioneered that concept, which you saw. There's a lot of that on CUGC and discussions, but basically, and Dave will talk you through the failure scenarios. But if you look on the right, super simple diagram, but essentially you have single site in this scenario. You have 2 zones. Instead of having, in that zone A, for instance, having 2 controllers in zone A and 2 controllers in zone B, you have 3. And you basically have 2 controllers in zone A, and that third controller for zone A is actually going in zone B, and you swap. So in the case of an outage with that primary zone, because the studio won't launch, can't do any management tasks when the primary zone's down. So that's a problem. You can technically run a command which will then change that over to the secondary and then satellite zone, and you can actually launch the console at that point. But this method is seamless. It's called it was pioneered as empty primary root, and it's pretty neat. And by doing this, you're essentially you have 2 controllers in the infrastructure primary, and then you'd have your satellite as for each of those sites, which is kind of cool. So that gives you that kind of always-on brokering. And the VDAs, technically, they're not going to ever register with another controller in another satellite zone, right? So you might say, oh, well, if my VDAs, if my local controllers go down because someone forgot to put anti-affinity rules on the hosting infrastructure or whatever, they'll just register with another site, and it doesn't work like that. It's going to go back to that primary zone. So it's important to have that set up.
Leroy.
Oh, okay. Key code word. So basically, some of the concepts here on catalog design. So if you did basically in a scenario where you had basically what we did actually. So if we had basically 2 sites and we had a catalog set up, and then we basically, I mean, for demo purposes, we did it with static VMs. But if you're doing machine creation services, these guys are going to talk through what it looks like from an image management perspective, how you replicate that image. You'd have the 2 separate catalogs, have your master image over here. They'll talk through that. But you're essentially going to have a single delivery group, and then it's going to contain resources from those 2 catalogs, and then you're able to have, in that case, sort of that active pin scenario, which we'll talk about what that looks like here in a second. So if you look at that from a delivery group standpoint, you're basically aggregating resources, and this is where you get to pinning. And when we say that term pinning, what we're talking about is pinning users or groups to specific zones, right, as their primary or home zone in that scenario. So,
or applications.
Huh?
Or
applications, right. So that's, I didn't circle it there. So yeah, so what we're showing in this slide, in this screenshot, is we have CTX zone UK South. So those people that launch in that group are going to always go to UK South unless there's a failure in that zone, or specific applications. Maybe out of your whole app stack, you have 5 apps that just aren't active, can't be run. It has a database that can't have writing into place, whatever. So basically, in that scenario, you would basically pin that application, that specific data center, and it would fail over after your infrastructure fails over, right? Then that would fail over. You have the ability of doing tagging as well, so you can do tags for different catalogs, different groups, and then you can do restrictions, so you can say only certain apps run on these specific controllers. You can also do it for if you're just doing an active passive site, you can use tags for that. There's a lot of neat things you can do with tags. Same thing with app groups. So I'm getting the look. But anything else you guys want to add here?
It's all good.
So much to talk. All right, so basically, the OU design is super critical because I've gone into too many sites where it's just a crappy OU design, a crappy policy design, and it just makes for a complete mess. So when you're doing multi-site, you can look at kind of a structure like this. Have your Citrix site, you have production, you have development, so you want a test site. Break under Citrix sites, you want to break your sites down. Then under each site, you want to have something for like catalogs and put all your catalogs in there, apps and desktop catalogs. Have your infrastructure, and then go into the next site and have your OUs kind of broken out like that, because then the next step is you can apply policies. And you can have policies, so things that we were talking about before, like VDA controller registrations, WEM-specific registrations to the broker, you can do those specific to those sites, and different policies like that. And you have a nice hierarchy set up there. So looking at DFS, we talked about that before, but basically what I'm saying here is referral status. This is key, is you can only have a single referral actually enabled at a time, otherwise you have an issue, right? And so even though the data is in sync, you got to make sure you're always pointing local. We're able to do that with that location variable that we talked about before. We are looking at doing some testing instead of using DFS, because there's a lot of DFS and there's some reliance on AD and things there. If you don't have two namespace servers, that's absolutely critical. It'll take down your whole environment. Had that happen on Monday night actually with a customer. So we're looking at possibility of doing GSLB instead for the naming, but there's some things there, considerations that we're looking at with some Microsoft stuff with strict naming and SPNs and stuff like that to see if that's a possibility, because that we feel would be a much more nice design. We can do some cool monitors and stuff for that, so we'll see. So image management, let's go.
Case.
Here you are, sir.
Yeah, thanks for handing it instead
Yes,
of throwing it.
I forgot you're injured.
So image management options, and we're looking at this from a hypervisor storage perspective. Looking at the options that we have, we'll have like the major buckets here are non-persistent, either machine creation services or provisioning services. Persistent can be full clones, and app layering is obviously something that is getting more and more attention in multi-site deployment. So looking at non-persistent desktop pools, how would you go about replicating that from a storage perspective? Now, if you look at any major storage provider that's out there, they'll have a concept where you can have your single image or single image management inside in this case, New York, and have a concept of storage replication. And that storage replication will allow you to migrate your golden image to that secondary site. So that way, you don't have to do, obviously, I'd say that automation is key. So build out your image management in an automated way. But this gives you the opportunity to leverage storage native replication and get your golden image from one site to another. Now, if we're doing full clones, it's quite similar, but we have a larger group of VMs. So we'll use storage replication and do grouping of a VM or multiple VMs and replicate that from one site to another. Now, obviously, multiple conditions can be set, synchronous replication, asynchronous replication. Maybe there are some SLAs you have with the business. I've seen that in multiple locations where C-level desktops are considered as more important than any other. So they'll have gold status, they get synchronous replication, but people like us, engineers, will get the silver model, where the desktop is only replicated every 4 hours or maybe 8 hours. Again, talk to your business, talk to them about their SLAs and their expectations. So we recorded a little demo here, and obviously I need to talk for 7 seconds through that bumper.
You're regretting doing that 7-second bumper now. You should have done three.
So what we're seeing here is an environment where we have AVM. It's running on ESX, and I've got another environment running AHV, Nutanix's own hypervisor. And what we're seeing here is a concept of storage replication. So we've got a remote site configured. We've got 2 different clusters configured here, and we've got a protection domain configured. And what we're seeing is that VM is being replicated from ESX to a separate cluster on AHV. Obviously, that brings a little bit of a complexity because we're doing cross-hypervisor migration or cross-hypervisor DR. But it does give, like Nutanix in this specific case, gives us the opportunity to promote that VM on a set replication schedule and have that VM available on the other side. And what we're seeing here is I'm forking off the clone into a new VM on the AHV environment. So this started off with my Windows 10 golden image on ESX. I configured protection domain to have storage native replication. And I'm replicating that golden image into a different cluster in a different site. And in this case, I'm running it on AHV. I'm cloning it off. I'll turn that VM on in a few seconds when the cloning process is done. And obviously, nothing goes wrong because the VM will start. It's things like this, and this is Nutanix. This is a Nutanix recorded demo, but all your storage vendors should have storage replication built in. And just take a look at that. If you want to do image replication, make sure that it's one of the technologies that you can use. And in this case, this is my, my clone VM. I'll turn it on, and you see that, the VM will start, and we'll have a Windows 10 desktop that we can fork off into a snapshot and create machine catalogs on this new cluster. So again, think about these replication technologies and think what's possible from a technology perspective, also from a storage replication perspective. It doesn't have to be fully application layer, but use this where possible, where it makes sense. If it's available from the application layer, like your DDCs, like StoreFront with global site load balancing, that's perfect. But up until now, there's no way to do image replication without going to your storage level. So, you know, there we go. We moved from ESX on one cluster to Nutanix AHV on another cluster with our golden image. Now,
Awesome.
I'm sorry.
I said that's awesome. Yeah.
So for non-persistent PVS, right, in a typical situation, and this is an example here where we have two sites, New York and LA. We've got PVS clusters in both locations. We've got four PVS servers in each location. What happens if I've got a new image, right? I've got a new VHDX that I want to distribute across the environment. This configuration right here means that I need 8 copies, 7 copies local and 1 across the wire. This is time consuming. Obviously, we've got tools that can help us there. I've seen DFSR, Robocopy, the VDIS replicator.
Yeah, VDIS replicator.
Exactly. So there are multiple options to help us there, but still they require manual configuration and things that we have to consider in terms of bandwidth. And again, it's error checking as well, especially if you go across multiple sites and multiple PVS clusters. It can be cumbersome to do something like this. Now, what if we would use something like a file server solution? In this case, where we see file servers presenting an SMB share to the PVS servers, we can have that one golden image or that one VHCX sitting on a file share. And when an update comes, we'll just have a copy across the wire. All my PVS servers are able to read from that new golden image, and we're done. An additional benefit here is that we can utilize Windows caching. So even if the SMB share would fail for whatever reason, as long as the image is cached into the RAM of the PVS server, everything will be operational. So we're actually simplifying the environment by reducing the number of copies that we take for our PVS vDisk, but we're also adding resiliency in the infrastructure.
So how does image management work with app layering in the picture? Anyone doing app layering in here? Any hands? So nice. Good amount of hands in here. So image management with app layering. The main thing with app layering is think about is the Elm appliance, the actual virtual management appliance, the elastic layers, and the user layers. Now, in the Elm appliance, you can export and import that into a disaster location or into a secondary site. The main thing with the Elm, though, is that once you have your elastic layers out there, once your user layers are set up, once you have your layered images out there, if the Elm does go down, those images will still run and work. Because everything there is on the Elm share as far as the assignments and so forth, the JSON file. So the main thing we're looking at there is replicating the user layers and the elastic layers. You know, of course, at some point, you'll have to import that into a new appliance once you bring that appliance back up. And hopefully, at some point, Citrix does an automation around this instead of being a manual step.
APIs.
What's that?
APIs.
APIs, baby. So app layering tips, use connector scripts. So with connector scripts, we can publish an image, kick off a workflow, which I'll show here in an example, and do things in that same multi-site scenario that Kay showed earlier of replicating that master image using storage replication. This CTX article is good for assigning the elastic layer repo and also the user layer repo as well. That way, in a multi-site scenario where Shane showed earlier, where you have your OU structure per site, you can point them to the proper location. That way, they're accessing those things from the local data center, not trying to go across data center. Here's an example publishing flow that we've done before and that we've done in the lab. So basically, you take your layered image, you compose it, you create the master VM, you snapshot the VM, you publish the MCS, your connector script kicks off, and that triggers your protection domain, your VM replication, and then your protection domain, that is picked up by the scheduler, that is replicated to the DR side, and then like Kay showed earlier in his example, you can go ahead and restore that VM, do a snapshot from it and do your images on the other side. That way you have that single element on one site, but have that same master image across site with the same OS ID. That way if you're doing user layers, it's not going to cause a problem.
And that last part can be scripted as well.
And that can be scripted as well. So
and creating machine
in this
catalogs.
example here, we have a nice little connector script here. So we did a connector script configuration. We have the agent installed, have a PowerShell script to create the protection domain. Once that picks it up, that script runs once you do the publishing workflow. And then from there, we get that protection domain, and that image is replicated across to our other data center. Again, you can restore it, do the MCS process, and go from there. Content collaboration, I'll go for this one pretty quick. The main thing here is that share file doesn't care as long as the data is there. Or sorry, Citrix, or whatever the new name is, sorry. Anyways, the main thing here, if you're doing storage zone controllers on-prem, you can active passive GSLB that, have redundancy inside the site, and then have some kind of file share storage and replicate that as well. I have had customers use cloud storage like Panzura, also to store it natively in Azure file services as well, or Azure blobs, whatever, to have that data highly available. But the main thing there is making sure the data is there on both sides. You could do an active-active. One thing I'm testing, I've been playing with Pure Software a lot, so I will be testing this active-active with Pure Software because it does that two replication to see if we can do a true active-active with share file data on-prem file services. Unified Endpoint Management, formerly known as Zen Mobile. The main thing here is if you're not using the cloud, unless you have a compelling reason, you should be using the cloud-hosted service of this. Take away the maintenance for that, take away the upgrades, take away the SQL pieces, and then just take care of the things on site. Have dual cloud connectors, do GSLB for the gateway, and then make sure your infrastructure components that are on site, like your Exchange, web apps, and so forth, are redundant as well. Now we're getting to failure scenarios.
It's the fun stuff.
So we broke this down quite a lot originally. We broke it all up into loads of different sections, but we literally just had loads of content. So
Oh man, he's stepping off the stage, ladies and gentlemen.
we're going to walk through just some of the things that that you need to consider when you're looking at failure domains. Where's the laser?
It's a
Is
green
it not
button.
working? Oh, there it is. Right, out
Hey,
here.
start here.
One of those buttons.
Right out here, you've got the your optimal gateway routes with GSLB domain names sitting right out in the DMZ. Out on the internet. You need to worry about that. Public-facing ADNS services. You need to definitely have more than one, so that if you lose this whole side, this one can reply. Active-passive or active-active or GSLB proximity gateways for remote access to your sites. You need to consider that. HA pair in region and then across multiple sites. You need to make sure you worry about that and make sure that they're there and resilient. Moving inside into your secure zone, again, highly available pairs of NetScalers. DNS, you need a resilient DNS service and identity needs to span across both of your regions. SQL, doesn't have to be a bag, could be always-on service group, always-on availability groups, but you need that platform to be highly available. And if it's not, you need to make sure that localhost cache works before you start dropping things out. Internal ADNS is exactly the same as external. You need presence in both data centers so that if you have a failure of a data center, the other data center will still pick up those things. Ticketing down here, make sure you've got more than one data center's presence for ticketing. Federated auth, there's a great article if you Google multi-site federated authentication. There's a good article about using group policy to make that multi-site aware and make sure that you're brokering from the right data center. Workspace environment management, this is what we were talking about. You always kind of want the broker to be pointing to the same DC as the VDAs, but you need active-passive failover. So what we did is we had active-passive going either way. StoreFront, GSLB, you can have active-passive. Same with Director. Same with licensing. This is this empty primary zone. So one of the things we did here is we built a controller in Liphook and one in Azure, put it into a primary zone, which was the virtual apps and desktops primary zone. Didn't provision anything from that zone, but that meant that if we lost data center A, you'd still have manageability of the farm because of using the broker in the other zone. This is all core infrastructure underneath. You need to make sure that that's replicated across the thing. When you change to Citrix Cloud, it gets way easier. Because
It's so beautiful.
there's nothing really you have to manage from other than the resource location. So you need to worry about cloud connectors. And this is if you're using everything out of Citrix Cloud. You don't have your own NetScalers, you don't have your own StoreFront, you're all in, everything in the cloud. It's all great. Stays up. So this is what you're using there. You need resilient cloud connectors in each site. There's some new technology where the VDA you can go direct rather than having to stream data through the cloud connector. The things you need to worry about are your image provisioning, how you manage them, and your core infrastructure. And we got a demo.
Right on.
So I'll go back up here. We should have time as well.
You got 7 seconds, man. You got plenty of time.
That's good.
As long as you don't have to walk on crutches.
Yeah. So what we're doing here is we are pinging the workspace. So you can see the 192.168.100 network is in libhook. So if we refresh that, we're using StoreFront that's running out of libhook at the moment. We're going to launch one of the desktops. And we're also going to fire up an application. See, we made sure we had the right wallpaper on the desktop as well. That was important, and the SYN number is right. On
We did brand WEM, but
the world's most critical application, Notepad.
Yeah. So now we have an application, and we have a desktop running. I think we switched to Studio. So if we look at what's actually going on behind the scenes for this, we had, you can see there the desktop itself is running from OPVDA02, which is actually running in libhook, so in the data center at home. And if you look at the application, it's running from OPVDA01, and that's because we pinned the Notepad application to run from the Azure data center as a primary and fail over to libhook, and we pinned the VDA to run from libhook as a primary and fail up to Azure if there's a
seamless to the
failure.
user. They have no idea.
The user doesn't know. It's just you launch it, and because WEM is brokered and everything's highly available or multi-site aware behind that, then it will just carry on working for the user. So now what we'll do is we'll start, and we're going to simulate an entire data center failure. So I switched off the cloud connectors, the SQL Server, the licensing server.
On-prem, right? Libhook?
Yeah, everything in libhook. We just shut it down. So you see both web servers are down. All three controllers are down. So that's the one in the empty primary zone. That's gone. And the two SQL servers gone. And the VDAs. I don't think I did anything else.
So you effectively just
you
pulled
just
out
switched
the
it off,
plugs.
pulled out
You
the
can see
plugs.
the connection.
You can see here the connection's interrupted. There's nothing you can do about that. Your users are going to get kicked out if you turn off the server that they're logged into. Because until they learn how to move that, which I doubt they ever will, then that's just the way it is. But everything else you can move around behind the scenes. So what we're doing here is we're logging onto the NetScaler that's up in the Azure tenant. All the virtual servers up there are still on. You can see if you go into GSLB, all of the stuff on premises in libhook is now gone. The GSLB MEP status between the two sites is gone, so that means we've lost ADNS on premises. You notice this is still running, and the reason is we pinned this to Azure, and we didn't just power off everything Azure, so the Notepad app isn't affected. For the user, so if we look at SQL, this is kind of similar to what Shane was showing earlier. You can see all those 4 bags for the 3 for the Citrix Virtual Apps and Desktops and the WEM. They've all moved up to Azure. If we do an NS lookup on the WEM for UK South, you can see that's going up to Azure. Here we'll jump into Studio.
Nice fade technique, by the way.
Yeah, that's good, wasn't You can see from Studio, we're still able to manage the farm. So we still have manageability of the farm, and that's because of how invented with this empty primary zone. So XD01 is gone. XD02 is in the same zone, but it's running from Azure rather than on premises. If we ping Workspace, you can see the Workspace has failed, and that's gone out to the cloud now. So that's now running from your Azure tenant and not on premises. If we refresh that and log back in,
50 seconds.
And the
Yeah.
folks in the back are getting nervous.
Yeah, I know.
They're like, shit, he's ignoring
you
the
can
wrap-up.
see when we log on, what you should be able to see is the application subscription database. You notice at the bottom there, you're using StoreFront in Azure, Node 1, and your application, your favorite, so it's a subscriptive store, but because the server group is in the same, all the servers are in the same group, that application subscription has been pushed out to the cloud. So from a user perspective, bar being kicked out of the VDA, which there's not much you can do about, is pretty good. Everything just moves up there. You can test these, all the failure that you need. Well, you're gonna have time, 9 seconds. And what you can see here,
We'll stay after for questions.
there you can see at the bottom there, you've got OP-VDA01, and that's running now the desktop and the application from Azure.
That's it, man. We're done.
And that is us. I'm sorry we don't have time for any questions, but we will hang around.
Yeah, we're going to hang around and answer questions. We appreciate everyone coming out.
Thank
Thanks
you.
everybody.
Thank
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Great job.